The morning of her wedding, Clara Voss was sitting on the cold floor of her father's empty study when she heard the carriages begin arriving outside. She had not planned to be on the floor. She had come in simply to retrieve her mother's pearl earrings, which she had stored in the locked drawer of her father's desk because it was the safest place she knew. And then she had opened the drawer and seen, beneath the velvet pouch, the last letter her father had written before the fever took him. She had read it once, the night he died. She had not read it since. She did not read it now. She simply looked at his handwriting, the particular slope of it, the way he always pressed too hard on the descenders, and something behind her sternum gave way without warning. She sat down on the floor. She was still in her dressing gown. Her maid was upstairs laying out the ivory silk. Outside, wheels on gravel, voices, the precise social laughter of people arriving somewhere important. Clara pressed the letter flat against her chest and stared at the ceiling and thought, with the exhausted honesty of a woman who had been composed for 3 months without interruption, that she was absolutely terrified, not of the marriage. She had made her peace with the marriage, or something close enough to peace that she could not tell the difference in daylight. What terrified her in the cold study on the floor was the specific fear she had refused to examine until this moment, that she had been wrong, that the 17 letters had been the act of a frightened girl playing at strategy, and that the man waiting at the altar of St. George's would see through every line of it and destroy her before she had drawn a full breath as his wife. She sat with that fear for exactly as long as she could afford to sit with it. Then she put the letter back in the drawer. She locked it. She put the pearl earrings in her palm and looked at them for a moment, small and white and deeply familiar, her mother's, her grandmother's before that, worn by women who had survived things. She stood up. She went upstairs and let her maid dress her. And she did not look frightened, because she had decided she was done being frightened, and Clara Voss, when she decided something, was formidably hard to argue with even by herself. The church was full of the wrong kind of silence, not reverence. Reverence is warm. It settles over a congregation like a hand. This silence was the kind that precedes a held breath, sharp and anticipatory and faintly hungry. The silence of 400 people who had come not to witness a marriage but to watch what happened when the Duke of Ravenshollow finally collected his prize. Edmund Ford stood at the altar. He was 34 years old and built like a man who had decided early that the world would accommodate his dimensions or be rearranged accordingly. Dark hair, dark coat, a jaw that suggested entire geological processes. He was, by the cold arithmetic of the marriage market, the greatest prize of his generation. He was also, by the private arithmetic of everyone who had ever negotiated with him, the most dangerous man in any room he entered. He had not built that reputation with noise. That was the thing people did not understand about Edmund Ford until it was too late. Loud men were manageable, their moves were telegraphed, their vanity made them predictable. Edmund was quiet. He acquired land, influence, and political connection with the patient accumulation of a man who understood that the most complete form of power was the kind nobody saw being assembled. When men opposed him, they found their credit recalled, their allies absent, their reputations subtly and permanently altered. No one could ever prove Edmund Ford had touched any of it. That, of course, was the point. He stood at the altar now with the absolute stillness of a man entirely at ease, watching the doors of St. George's and thinking about almost nothing. He was not nervous. He was never nervous. He was simply waiting, in the way that he had always waited for things he had already decided were his. The doors opened, and the woman who walked through them was not entirely what he had prepared for. He had met Lady Clara Voss once, formally, 6 weeks prior. He had noted that she was handsome in a quiet, serious way, that she answered his solicitor's questions with the precision of someone who had prepared but was not performing preparation, and that her eyes, when she looked at him, did not do the thing that most people's eyes did, which was to find somewhere else to be. She had looked at him directly and without apology, and he had filed it away as either boldness or ignorance, and had not at the time felt it necessary to determine which. He watched her walk the aisle now, alone, no escort. She had refused one apparently, and he revised the filing. Not ignorance. She was dressed in ivory silk that caught the light from the high windows and held it. She carried white roses. She wore small pearl earrings and an expression of such complete, deliberate serenity that it struck him with a sensation he did not immediately identify as the most disciplined thing he had ever seen on a human face. Because he knew, he had made it his business to know exactly what her circumstances were, the debts, the mortgaged estate, the younger sister's uncertain future. He knew what this marriage cost her, and she walked toward it as though she had chosen it from a range of equally appealing options. He found, standing at the altar of St. George's, that he could not look away. She reached his side. She did not look at him. She faced forward, chin level, roses steady, and the Bishop of London cleared his throat and began. The words of the ceremony moved through the church in the practiced cadences of the established ritual. Edmund listened to them with the portion of his attention they deserved, and spent the remainder of it on the woman beside him, the particular quality of her stillness, the way she breathed, measured and deliberate, the way she responded at each correct moment, in a voice that was clear without being loud. He had expected fear, not visible fear. He had not expected her to weep or tremble. He was not a fool. But he had expected the particular contracted quality that people wore in his presence, when they were managing it. The slightly over-controlled movements, the fraction of a second, too long before each response. She was not managing anything, or if she was doing it so completely that the management had become indistinguishable from genuine composure. It bothered him in a way he could not yet name. In the pause between the reading and the vows, Edmund turned his head very slightly and leaned toward her. The congregation saw the Duke lean toward his bride. Several women in the front pew found it moving. "Before this is finished," he said, his voice below the threshold of anyone else's hearing, his eyes still on the bishop, "I want you to understand your position." He paused, precisely one beat. "I know things about your father, documented things, the kind that would eliminate whatever remains of the Voss name if they reached the appropriate ears. I have no present intention of using them, provided our arrangement proceeds sensibly." Another pause. "I can ruin you with one word. I want you to know that clearly, and to know that I mean it." He felt her go very still beside him, not the stillness of fear, something else. Something he did not have a category for yet, and then Lady Clara Voss, soon to be the Duchess of Ravenshollow, turned her head toward him by exactly the same degree that he had turned his, leaned toward him by exactly the same measure, and said, in a voice as level and unhurried as a woman reading aloud from a book she had already finished, "How interesting. I had already done that to you." The silence inside Edmund Ford lasted the length of one heartbeat. It was not a comfortable silence. He did not move. He was too controlled to move. But something happened behind his eyes that Clara, who was watching from the periphery of her own forward gaze, noted and catalogued carefully. It was not rage she had prepared for. It was something rawer than rage and more interesting. It was the expression of a man who has just discovered that the room he believed he was standing in has different dimensions than the ones he mapped. Edmund Ford had not been surprised by another person in 11 years. Clara faced forward. She said her vows in a clear and steady voice. She allowed the ring to be placed on her finger. She accepted the bishop's pronouncement with the serene attention of a woman entirely present in the moment, and she thought, distantly, of a Tuesday morning in March and the thin rain and the letters leaving her hand one by one, and she thought, "Your move," and then she thought, "No, actually, I believe that was mine. Let us go back. 12 weeks. It had taken Clara 4 days after saying yes to Mr. Graves, the Duke's man of business, to begin understanding what she had agreed to. Not the marriage itself, the man. She had spent those 4 days in her father's library, which still smelled of him. Old paper and pipe smoke and the particular dusty warmth of a room that had been thought in for 40 years. She had read parliamentary records, business filings, the dry and reliable columns of the financial press, and a great deal of careful correspondence with Mr. Thomas Henley, her father's oldest friend, a solicitor of 40 years' standing and immovable personal integrity, who had agreed, on the basis of that old friendship and what Clara suspected was a deeply suppressed outrage at what he had been watching, to speak with complete frankness. What he told her over 3 conversations, in the hushed, deliberate tones of a man handling something that could detonate, was this. Edmund Ford, Duke of Ravenshollow, had spent 7 years engaged in the systematic illegal seizure of tenant farmland across 3 counties. Not crudely. Nothing about him was crude. He had done it through a network of proxy land agents, manufactured enclosure agreements, and leveraged local magistrates who owed him money or favors or both. Families who had farmed the same land for generations had been quietly, methodically removed. Some had found other situations, many had not. The documentation of it was scattered, held by people who feared him too much to act alone, incomplete in isolation but devastating in aggregate. Clara had listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she had sat alone in the library for the remainder of the evening. She thought about the families. She was from Wiltshire. She knew what it looked like. when a farming family packed a cart. She had been 14 years old when the Croft family, tenants on a neighbouring estate, had left in February with everything they owned on a single wagon and 3 children in the back of it, and she had stood at the window and watched them go and asked her father where they were going, and her father had said, very quietly, "Nowhere good, Clara," and had looked sad for the rest of the day. She thought about 400 families. She thought about February carts. She thought about the leather folio on Mr. Graves' knee, and the cold, winter-sea eyes of the man who had sent him, and she thought about her father's letter in the locked drawer, which she had not been able to read since the night he died, but whose last line she carried in her memory without effort, because it was the last thing he had ever written to her, and she suspected it would be. The last thing she forgot before she died. "You are the finest argument I have ever made, my darling. Do not waste yourself on a small life." Clara closed the library and went to her writing desk. She wrote 17 letters, one to Mr. Henley with precise instructions for the consolidation of evidence. One to a journalist at the Times whose coverage of the enclosure debates had been thorough and fearless, and whose name she had written down 2 years prior for no reason she could have then articulated. 4 to individuals named in Henley's account as holding documentary evidence, written with specific, informed language that told them she knew exactly what they had and exactly why it mattered, and that she had the means to ensure it reached people, with the authority to act. 6 to members of a parliamentary committee currently examining land reform, each accompanied by a signed affidavit and a precise index of the available documentation. 5 to tenant representatives who had tried to petition and been silenced, telling them that their petitions would now be heard, that the evidence was being consolidated, that they were not alone. She signed none of them with her own name. She had no wish to be a martyr. She had a wish to be effective. She posted them on a Tuesday morning in the thin March rain, walking to the village post office herself, and with each letter she placed on the counter she felt something she had not felt since her father died. The specific physical sensation of a person who has stopped waiting for someone else to act and started acting themselves. It felt like standing up straight after a very long time of being slightly hunched. She walked home in the rain and she was not afraid. Or rather, she was afraid, she was terrified. Her hands were not quite steady until she had walked half a mile, but the fear was the kind that exists alongside action rather than instead of it, and she had decided she preferred that kind. The legal proceedings took 6 weeks to consolidate. Mr. Henley was meticulous. The parliamentary committee moved with the speed of an institution that had been waiting for exactly this form of organized case, and the Times journalist published his first piece the week before the wedding, careful and sourced and precise, landing in London like a stone dropped from a height into still water. By the morning of St. George's, 2 parliamentary inquiries had formally opened. 3 of the Duke's land agents had been publicly named. His most significant political ally had quietly withdrawn his association. The legal architecture that had protected Ravenshollow for 7 years had developed cracks of the self-propagating variety. Edmund Ford did not yet know who had built the case against him. He suspected a political enemy. He was confident he would find the source. He had set his investigators to work with the assurance of a man who had never been outmaneuvered by someone he had not considered worth watching. He had not looked closely enough at his bride. The reception was held at Ravenshollow House on Park Lane, a building of such deliberate architectural grandeur that it appeared to be making a philosophical argument about the nature of consequence. Clara moved through its rooms with the attentive patience of a woman learning the geography of a territory she intended to understand completely. Edmund found her at 4:30, standing near the tall window of the east drawing-room with a glass of champagne she was not drinking, watching the room with the steady observational calm of someone who had been watching rooms for a long time. He came to stand beside her, he said, without preamble, because preamble was not something he bothered with. "What did you mean at the altar?" Clara turned the champagne glass slowly in her hand. "I meant," she said, "exactly what I said. You know nothing that could damage me. I know rather a great deal, in fact." A pause. 17 letters worth. The thing that crossed his face then was not what she expected. She had expected anger. Anger she had prepared contingencies for. She had mentally rehearsed 3 different responses to 3 different forms of it. The cold, controlled kind, the flat, dangerous kind. The kind that looked like nothing at all but promised consequences. She had prepared for all 3. She had not prepared for what actually happened, which was this. Edmund Ford looked at her and for approximately 4 seconds he said absolutely nothing. And in those 4 seconds, something moved across his face that was entirely unguarded and entirely unexpected. It was not rage. It was not even calculation. It was a grief so quickly suppressed she almost missed it. Almost. It was there and then it was gone. Replaced by the familiar granite control, and he said very evenly, the parliamentary inquiry. Inquiries, she said, plural. The second opened on Thursday. She kept her voice level. The Times piece was more restrained than it might have been. I suspect the journalist is saving the remainder. You did this, not a question. I did, she said. For the families across your land in Yorkshire and Durham and Westmoreland who had nowhere to go when you needed an additional 12% return on estates you had never visited. She looked at him directly. I want you to understand that it was not about you. It was about them. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something she had not anticipated, quietly, without apparent effect. How many families? Clara looked at him. 417 by Mr. Henley's count. Across 3 counties, another silence. Longer. I was told 40, he said. At most. The flatness of his voice told her nothing and everything. She did not know, standing there, whether she believed him or whether he was simply very good at adjusting his position in real time. She was honest with herself about that uncertainty. She filed it without resolving it. It was 417, she said again. He said nothing further for a moment. Then, you walked into this marriage knowing what you had done. I walked into this marriage, she said, because my sister deserves a future, and the staff at Wiltshire deserve their positions, and I had no intention of arriving here without something to stand on. She turned to face him more fully. I am not your enemy, I am your wife. But I believe it would be productive if we were both entirely clear from this moment about what that means. And what does it mean? It means the families in Durham are offered restoration of their tenancies before the committee requires it, because doing it willingly is the difference between a difficult season and a catastrophic one. It means the land agents are removed because they are a liability you no longer have the political cover for, and because it is correct. It means I am a genuine partner in the management of this estate. I know these accounts, I know the land, I know people you have never considered worth knowing. She held his gaze, and it means you will never threaten me or mine again. Not once. Not in private, not in implication, never again. Edmund Ford stood in his own drawing room surrounded by 400 guests and looked at his wife. Later, much later, when Clara would try to identify the precise moment that things shifted between them, she would return to this one. Not because he said anything remarkable, not because he capitulated or softened or showed any of the signs that novels promised, but because of what he did next, which was nothing at all. He simply stood there and looked at her with an expression that, for the first time since she had known him, she could not read at all, and the unreadability of it was somehow more unsettling than anything else he had shown her. Then he said very quietly, 417, and walked away. She found him that night in the library. It was past midnight. The guests were long gone. The house had settled into the particular silence of an old building after people have left it, creaking and vast. Clara had not been able to sleep and had gone looking for a book and had found instead her husband standing in the middle of the library with a glass of brandy he was not drinking, staring at the painting above the fireplace. It was a landscape, Yorkshire moorland, wide and grey and true. She stopped in the doorway. He did not turn around. I bought that 6 years ago, he said, from an estate sale in the West Riding. A pause. The family that sold it had been on that land for 200 years. Another pause, longer. I did not know that at the time. I did not ask. Clara stood in the doorway of the library and looked at the back of his head and thought about the grief she had seen on his face for 4 seconds in the drawing room, and she thought about a man who had inherited an empire at 19 and had run it with the cold efficiency of someone who had learned very early that questions were vulnerabilities, and she thought, with the careful honesty she applied to everything, that she did not know yet what kind of man he was. She knew what he had done. She did not know, with any certainty, who had taught him to do it. She was not ready to forgive him. She was not sure she was required to decide that tonight. But she crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at the painting, and she said nothing, and he said nothing, and they stood in the library at midnight and looked at a piece of Yorkshire that had been sold away from people who had loved it. And Clara felt the full weight of everything she had set in motion, all 17 letters, all the evidence, all 417 families, and she felt, for the first time since the post office in the rain, not certain. Not uncertain enough to have acted differently. She would have posted those letters 10 times over and never hesitated. But the thing about doing the right thing, she was learning, was that it was never as clean as it looked from the outside. There were no clean things. There were only honest things, and she had been honest, and she was going to have to live inside the consequences of that honesty with this man for the rest of her life. And she did not know yet what that meant. She thought of her father, not the letter. The man himself, sitting at this desk on winter evenings with lamplight on his face, telling her that the hardest thing about integrity was not choosing it once, but choosing it consecutively, every morning, even on the mornings when you were tired. She exhaled slowly. The painting should go back, she said, to the family if they can be found, or to the estate in trust. A long silence. Yes, said Edmund Ford, it should. They did not say anything else. They stood for a while longer, and then Clara said goodnight and went to bed, and she lay in the dark of the Duchess's chamber and stared at the ceiling, and thought that she had absolutely no idea what she had married, and that she was going to have to find out, and that finding out was perhaps the most frightening prospect of all of them. She fell asleep before she had resolved any of it. In the library below, Edmund Ford remained for another hour in front of the painting of the Yorkshire moor. The parliamentary proceedings lasted 8 months. They were thorough, public, and deeply uncomfortable for the Duke of Ravenshollow, which was, by the reckoning of every decent person in London, entirely appropriate. Edmund appeared before the committee in October. He answered questions for 6 hours. He did not dissemble. That had been Clara's first surprise, watching the transcripts in the library each evening, the pile of them growing on the corner of the desk. He could have dissembled. His solicitors had provided him with 17 different versions of events that were technically defensible. He had used none of them. He answered what was asked completely, without embroidery in either direction, and when the questions reached the moments of greatest personal consequence, he did not flinch, and he did not deflect, and he did not look for the exit. It was, Clara thought, reading transcript after transcript in the lamplight, the most honest she had ever seen anyone be at the worst possible moment, to be honest. She did not say this to him. Their arrangement in those 8 months was a working one. They shared the library most evenings. They discussed the estate accounts, which were extensive and in several places deeply problematic, and Clara had opinions about all of them that she expressed with a directness he had, initially bristled at, and had since apparently decided to accept as a feature of the arrangement. She knew the Wiltshire tenancies, the crop rotations, the particular economics of farming communities that were visible only to people who had grown up near them. He knew the larger financial architecture, the markets, the political implications of the land reform legislation moving through Parliament. Between them they covered the ground faster than either would have alone. It was not comfortable. That was the second thing she had not expected. She had expected the working arrangement to be smooth, because she had imagined that a man of Edmund's control would manage the practical dimensions of a partnership efficiently. What she had not accounted for was that he had absolutely no practice at being challenged and found it, in the beginning, reflexively infuriating. 3 weeks into the proceedings he came into the library while she was reviewing the Durham accounts and said without greeting, "You have written to the committee again." "I have," she said, without looking up, without consulting me, about the Dunmore families, specifically. The evidence of their displacement was incomplete in the October submission, and I had additional documentation from Mr. Henley. She looked up. "I sent a copy to your solicitor simultaneously. They are my proceedings," he said. The control in his voice was the effortful kind. "They concern my conscience," she said, "which is not a thing that waits for consultation." He stared at her. "You are the most inconvenient person I have ever encountered," he said. "I expect that is true," she agreed pleasantly, "given who you have spent time with." The silence that followed was sharp-edged and held for several seconds. Then something happened that she had seen once before, in the drawing room on the wedding day. Something moved across his face that was not quite what she expected. Not anger, not ultimately. Something that looked, at the far edge of it, almost like the beginning of humor. He sat down. "Show me the Dunmore documentation," he said. Clara showed him. He read it for a long time without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "There were children in Dunmore, under 12. I saw their names in the petition." He paused. "I was told the petition was falsified." "It was not falsified," she said. "No," he said. "I know that now." She watched him. He was not performing remorse. She had seen performed remorse. She knew what it looked like. The slight overemphasis of it, the audience awareness. This was something else. This was a man doing the very private, very unglamorous work of understanding something about himself that he had preferred not to understand, and finding it a harder job than he had anticipated. She thought again of the 4 seconds of grief in the drawing room. She thought of the painting going back to the family. She thought of 6 hours of unembroidered testimony before the parliamentary committee. She did not soften toward him. Not yet. She was not made of quick softening, and he had not earned it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she filed these things carefully, as she filed everything, and she made a note to herself that the question of what kind of man Edmund Ford was had not yet been fully answered, and that she was no longer certain it would be answered the way she had initially assumed. It was not comfortable, being uncertain. She had built her certainty carefully over months, and it had sustained her through a great deal. She was not entirely pleased to find it becoming more complicated. She told herself that complicated was not the same as wrong. She went to bed that night and lay awake rather longer than she would have liked. He went to Yorkshire in November, unannounced, no letter beforehand, no explanation afterward. He was simply gone one morning and back 4 days later, arriving at Ravenshollow House at 6:30 in the evening, grey with cold and road dust, and he went directly to the library and sat at the desk for a long time before Clara found him. She came in with a lamp. He looked up. His face was not the face she had married. Or rather, it was the same face, but something had moved behind it that had not been there before. Something that looked, she thought, like a man who had been confronted with the actual physical weight of an abstraction he had lived with, long enough to have made comfortable and had found it was not in fact comfortable at all. "I went to Dunmore," he said. Clara set the lamp on the desk and sat down across from him. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know, I went in September, with Mr. Henley." She paused. "I did not tell you because I did not think you were ready to hear it." He was quiet for a moment. "And now you have seen it yourself," she said, "which is better than being told." Edmund Ford sat at his desk in the lamplight and looked at his wife and said, after a long time, "There was a woman in the village. Her name was Mrs. Crail. She had 4 children. She had been farming that land for 23 years before my agents removed her. She is living now in 2 rooms above a tanner." He stopped. "She showed me the original tenancy agreement my father had signed. She had kept it. All this time she had kept it, this folded paper, in a box under her bed, as though it would eventually mean something again." He said nothing further. Clara did not say anything either. She did not offer him reassurance or perspective or the managed comfort that the situation might have seemed to call for. She simply sat with him in the library in the lamplight and let the full weight of Mrs. Crail and her 4 children and her folded paper occupy the room the way it deserved to occupy it, without being softened or resolved or moved along. She had learned from her father that some things needed to be sat with. They sat with it for a while. Then Clara said, "The restoration offer goes to Durham first this week, before the committee requires it." She paused, and Mrs. Crail's tenancy is restored specifically, with a written apology on ducal letterhead, not legal language. "A letter in your hand." Edmund looked at her. "Yes," he said, "all of it." They did not speak much after that, but when Clara rose to go to bed, she paused at the door and said, without turning around, "The woman you told me about, Mrs. Crail, I want to know that she is all right. Not through Mr. Henley, I want to write to her myself." She heard him exhale behind her, a long, slow exhale, the kind that has been held for some time. "I will give you her address," he said. She nodded and went to bed, and this time she fell asleep quickly, and she could not entirely have said why. The ruling came down in February, decisive and public and extensively reported. Edmund Ford was required to pay significant financial restitution, restore all displaced tenancies across 3 counties, and submit to independent review of his landholdings for 5 years. The penalty was substantial. The damage to his political standing was more so. 3 of his closest allies in Parliament removed themselves from his orbit with the quiet efficiency of men who had been looking for an occasion. The clubs of Mayfair performed the social consequences with their customary elaborate understatement. Edmund bore all of it with the granite-faced equanimity of a man who had decided to absorb the cost and remain standing, which he did, and which Clara, watching him do it, noted was its own form of dignity. It was the evening after the ruling that they had their first real fight. It had been building for days. She could see that afterward. The tension of the proceedings, the verdict, the public nature of all of it, the particular strain of a man who had controlled every aspect of his life for 15 years. Watching a significant portion of it adjudicated, publicly. She had felt it in the library each evening, a tightness in the room, a quality of conversation that was careful in the way that careful things are when they are covering something less careful underneath. It broke over nothing, or what appeared to be nothing. Clara had written to Mrs. Crail, as she had said she would, and had received back a letter so dignified and so painful and so devoid of bitterness that she had sat with it for a long time. She had then, without discussing it with Edmund, made arrangements through Mr. Henley for an independent income to be settled on Mrs. Crail and her children from the restitution fund, ensuring their stability regardless of what happened with the tenancy. Edmund found out from Mr. Henley and came to find her in the drawing room. "You arranged this without my knowledge," he said. "I did again. Yes, this is my restitution. My reparation. It is a woman with 4 children living in 2 rooms above a tanner's," Clara said, looking up from her correspondence. "The mechanism by which she receives help is considerably less important than the fact that she receives it. That is not the point." "What is the point?" "The point," he said, and she heard it then, the real thing beneath the surface of the argument, "is that you do not trust me to do it myself." The room went very still. Clara set down her pen. She looked at her husband, standing across the room from her, and she thought about all the things she could say, the accurate things, the things that were true, which was that no, she had not trusted him to do it himself, because trusting him had not been something she had built yet, because trust was not a thing she was made of quickly, because he had stood at the altar of St. George's and whispered a threat into her ear, and she had spent 3 months before that building a case against him, and none of that disappeared, simply because he had gone to Yorkshire and come back changed. She thought about saying all of that. It was all true. Instead, she said, "You are right." He looked at her. "I did not trust you to do it," she said. "I am being honest with you. I have not trusted you, not fully, because I have not had sufficient reason to yet, and I do not manufacture trust I have not earned a right to feel." She paused. "But you went to Yorkshire. You wrote to Mrs. Crail yourself. You gave 6 hours of unembroidered testimony. You are building a reason." She held his gaze. "I am trying to notice it. I am not as quick at this as you perhaps need me to be, but I am trying." The silence that followed was a different quality from all the ones before it. Edmund stood across the room and looked at his wife in the lamplight and said nothing for a long time. Then he sat down, not in his usual chair. In the chair opposite her, the one he never used, the closer one. "I stood at that altar," he said, "and I threatened you. Yes. On the morning of our wedding, before we had spoken more than twice." He paused. "I want to tell you that I did it because it was strategy, because I wanted you to know your position, because it was simply how I operated and I had not considered whether it was right." Another pause, longer. "But I think the honest account of it is that I was afraid you would leave, that you would find some means of extracting yourself, and I would lose the arrangement I had constructed, and I chose to preempt that by making sure you understood the cost of it." He looked at the table. "It was not strategy, it was fear. That is the honest account." Clara looked at him. She thought about the post office in the rain. She thought about the floor of her father's study that morning. She thought about what fear looked like when it wore control as a coat and threatened people as a means of not being left. She did not forgive him in that moment, not wholly. She was not built for instant wholeness. But she said, "That is the most honest thing you have said to me." "It may be the most honest thing I have said to anyone," he said. The lamplight held them both for a moment. "Then we will start from here," she said. They were married again in spring. Not literally, not in any church. But the marriage that had been made at St. George's in June under the respective pressures of debt and strategy transformed itself over the following months into something that bore the name more honestly, quietly and without announcement, the way real things tend to become real. It happened in the library, in the accounts, in long arguments about the estate that were genuine arguments, contested and concluded, and occasionally loud, between 2 people who each had intelligence and opinions and the stubbornness to defend them. It happened in the morning she found him already at his desk at 5:30, annotating the committee report with pencil notes so precise and thorough they constituted a separate document, and felt, with considerable inconvenience, that she admired his mind. It happened in the evening he came to find her in the garden and stood beside her in the late light without speaking, and she understood that he had come because he wanted to be near her, not because he needed anything from her, simply because he wanted to be near her, and she felt something shift in her chest that was quiet and certain, and did not ask to be named immediately. She named it eventually, in her own time. In the way she did everything, he had been faster to it. She suspected he had known longer. He did not rush her, which was perhaps the most surprising thing he had done since the wedding, and which she suspected had cost him, and which she was quietly grateful for. Love, when it arrived, felt less like an event and more like a recognition, like discovering that something had been true for long enough that it no longer needed to be argued for. In the spring of the following year, Edmund Ford stood at the door of her father's study on the Wiltshire estate, which Clara had insisted they visit quarterly, and watched her sit at the old desk with her hands flat on the wood in the particular way she had of thinking, and said, "What are you doing?" "Thinking," she said. "About what?" She was quiet for a moment. "Whether he would have liked you." Edmund came into the room. He sat in the chair across from the desk, the chair where solicitors and tenants and occasionally Clara herself had sat over many years and been listened to. "And," he said. Clara looked at the desk. "He would have been suspicious of you for a very long time," she said. "He was an excellent judge of character, and he was not quick to revise a judgment." She paused. "But he valued honesty above almost everything, and I think he would have come to see it in you." She looked up. Eventually, Edmund was quiet. "I owe him an apology as well," he said. "You cannot give him one." "No." He looked at the painting on the wall of the study, her father in military dress, younger than Clara had ever known him. "Then I will spend the time I would have spent on it doing right by the things he built." He paused. "Including you." Clara looked at her husband across her father's desk. She thought of 17 letters in the rain. She thought of a threat at the altar. She thought of 417 families, and 6 hours of testimony, and a painting going back to the people who had loved it, and a woman called Mrs. Crail who had written back to Clara with a dignity that had made her cry, which she had done alone in the library, and not told anyone about. She thought of a man standing in front of a Yorkshire landscape at midnight, with a brandy he was not drinking, saying 417 in the voice of someone counting something. "Good," she said. "Then we are agreed." 3 years after the wedding at St. George's, the village of Dunmore in the West Riding of Yorkshire built a new schoolhouse. It was a modest building, good Yorkshire stone, deep-set windows that caught the light on clear days, a slate roof that would outlast everyone who laid it. It sat at the edge of the village green, and it held, on the morning it opened, 43 children who had not previously had anywhere to learn. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow attended without announcement, arriving the evening before in a plain carriage, staying at the village inn like ordinary people, which Dunmore found charming and slightly baffling in equal measure. Edmund stood at the back of the schoolroom and watched the children settle into their benches with the absorbed fidgeting of small people in new places. A girl of about 8 was tracing the letters carved into the front of her desk with one careful finger. She was not reading them. She was simply feeling them, the shape of them, the fact of them, with the expression of someone who has been given access to something they understand is important without yet knowing fully why. Edmund watched her for a long time. Clara was beside him. She had been watching him watch the girl. "She will be reading by summer," Clara said quietly. "Yes," he said. Outside, Mrs. Crail stood with her 4 children in the village lane. She was a broad-shouldered woman of 50, with the particular bearing of someone who had survived a great deal, and had not allowed the surviving to make her small. When Edmund crossed the room and went out to her, Clara did not follow. She stayed at the window and watched him take Mrs. Crail's hand in both of his and speak to her, and watched Mrs. Crail look at him for a long moment with the appraising steadiness of a woman who had learned to be an excellent judge of sincerity, and watched her nod once, and watched Edmund nod back. He stood with her for several minutes. He crouched down to speak to the children. The youngest one, a boy of perhaps 5, showed him something in his pocket, with the urgent seriousness of small children, presenting important objects. Edmund looked at it with complete attention. Clara stood at the window of the Dunmore schoolhouse and felt something full and warm and complicated move through her chest, the way things did when they were true. He came back to her. They stood together in the doorway and looked at the village, at the lane full of people who had been told they were forgotten and had not been, at the fields beyond, wide and green and being farmed by the families who had always known best how to tend them, at the morning light coming down across the Yorkshire moor without prejudice or preference, the same light on all of it. Inside, behind them, the girl who had been tracing the carved letters looked up from her desk and, without particular announcement, read the sentence in front of her aloud. It was a simple sentence, a child's sentence. It described a field in the morning. Clara heard it and closed her eyes for one moment, and her father was with her in that moment, warm and fully present, and she heard him say, the way he sometimes still could. "There you are, my darling. There is your good life." She opened her eyes. Edmund's hand found hers at their side. In the parish records of Dunmore, in the register of donations for the schoolhouse fund, the clerk had written 2 names. They were the same size. Neither appeared first. The ink was the same, entered in the same hand on the same morning. 2 names that had arrived at this place by a long and unlikely road, and had chosen when they got here to sign together. Outside, the fields went on and on under the Yorkshire sky, ordinary and extraordinary in the way that only real things are, tended and alive, and the morning held all of it without effort, the way mornings do, the way they always have, the way they always will. If any part of this moved you, if the altar scene landed, if the midnight library stopped you, if Mrs. Crail made you feel something, if that last morning in Dunmore gave you the particular fullness that only true things give, please share this story. Send it to a friend, a sister, someone who loves a woman who chose courage. Subscribe if you would like to read more, because I have more in me, and I would be so deeply honored to tell them to you. Your kindness in reading this far means more than I know how to say properly. Thank you.